When my mother stood up during my wedding reception and announced that my sister was pregnant, declaring, quote, "The real celebration starts now," I just smiled and applauded. But that smile would become the foundation of a transformation that turned public humiliation into a multi-million-dollar empire that changed everything about how I understood success, family, and my own worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of the Grandview Country Club cast dancing shadows across the pristine white tablecloths as I surveyed the wedding reception that had consumed 18 months of meticulous planning. Every detail had been orchestrated to perfection. The ivory roses imported from Ecuador, the champagne fountain that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, the string quartet playing softly in the corner, while 200 of Richmond's most prominent families celebrated what the society pages would later call the wedding of the season. At 29, I had achieved what every woman in my social circle had been groomed to accomplish. I was Mrs. Alexander Whitmore, wife to the heir of Whitmore Industries, a woman who would never need to work but whose full-time occupation would be maintaining the kind of lifestyle that served as inspiration and aspiration for others. My wedding dress, a custom creation that had required 6 fittings and cost more than the average annual salary, represented the culmination of a life spent preparing for this moment. But as I stood beside Alexander, accepting congratulations from guests who spoke in the carefully modulated tones of old money and inherited privilege, I felt something I had not anticipated on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Beneath the satisfaction of having executed a flawless event, beneath the relief of having successfully navigated the complex social and financial negotiations that comprised a merger between 2 established families, I felt profoundly empty. The feeling had been building for months, a quiet voice of doubt that grew stronger with each wedding planning session, each discussion about our future that focused exclusively on social obligations and financial strategies. Alexander was a good man by every conventional measure, educated at the finest schools, established in a prestigious career, committed to maintaining the family reputation and fortune. Our relationship was built on shared backgrounds, compatible social positions, and mutual respect for the traditions that had shaped both our families. Yet standing in my wedding reception, surrounded by everything I had been taught to want, I could not escape the realization that none of this felt authentically mine. The venue had been selected based on its reputation and exclusivity rather than any personal connection. The guest list comprised people who were important to invite, rather than people whose presence would bring genuine joy. Even the menu had been chosen to impress rather than to reflect our preferences or create meaningful moments of connection. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, moved through the reception with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 30 years orchestrating social events that reinforced her family's position in Richmond society. At 55, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from a lifetime of careful maintenance, professional styling, and the confidence that accompanied never having to question whether she belonged in any social situation. She had spent the past 18 months treating my wedding as her masterpiece, a demonstration of her ability to execute an event that would be discussed and admired for years to come. "Darling, you look absolutely radiant," she said, appearing at my side with the timing that suggested she had been monitoring my expression and decided intervention was necessary. "Mrs. Henderson was just telling me how impressed she is with the floral arrangements. She wants to know who your coordinator was for Victoria's engagement party next spring." I smiled and provided the requested information, falling automatically into the role I had been trained to play since childhood. The conversation flowed smoothly through topics that required no authentic engagement. Compliments on the event's execution, updates on mutual acquaintances, subtle inquiries about our honeymoon plans and future social calendar. These interactions required skill and attention, but they demanded nothing of my inner self. Nothing that would reveal who I actually was beneath the carefully constructed persona I had been perfecting for decades. Alexander appeared beside me, his hand settling on my waist with the proprietary comfort of ownership. At 32, he possessed the understated confidence that came from never having questioned his place in the world or his right to everything he had inherited. His conversation with other guests focused on business opportunities, investment strategies, and political developments that might affect their various financial interests. He was intelligent and well-informed, capable of discussing complex topics with authority and insight. but his perspective never extended beyond the concerns of his particular social and economic class. "The Hendersons are interested in that property development opportunity I mentioned," he said quietly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who viewed social events primarily as networking opportunities. "I think we should arrange a dinner party next month to discuss the details properly." I nodded and made appropriate responses, but my attention was caught by a conversation at the table nearest to us. Two women I did not recognize were discussing their daughter's career achievements. One had recently been promoted to partner at a law firm, while the other had launched a nonprofit organization focused on educational equity. Their pride was evident and unguarded, their excitement genuine as they shared details about their daughter's work and impact. The contrast with my own situation became suddenly, overwhelmingly clear. These women were celebrating their daughter's accomplishments, their contributions to the world, their ability to create value and meaning through their own efforts. I was being celebrated for having successfully married well, for having secured my financial future through strategic alliance rather than personal achievement. The realization hit with the force of physical impact. At 29, I had never earned a paycheck, never solved a problem that mattered to anyone beyond my immediate social circle, never created anything that would exist without the financial support of my family or husband. My education at prestigious institutions had been treated as social preparation rather than professional development. My volunteer work with approved charities had been performed more for social positioning than genuine commitment to causes I cared about. I had been groomed for this moment, this wedding, this marriage, this life of elegant irrelevance, and I had accepted it without question because I had never been presented with alternatives that seemed realistic or attainable. But as I stood in my perfect wedding reception, wearing my perfect dress, married to my perfect husband, I felt like I was disappearing into a life that would never require me to become fully myself. The dinner service proceeded with the flawless execution that significant financial investment could ensure. Each course was presented with artistic precision, accompanied by wine selected to complement both the food and the sophisticated palates of our guests. Conversations flowed smoothly around topics considered appropriate for such occasions: travel experiences, cultural events, mutual acquaintances, and carefully neutral observations about current events that avoided any suggestion of political controversy. I participated in these conversations with the skills I had been developing since childhood, offering thoughtful responses and asking engaging questions that kept discussions flowing pleasantly. But beneath my polished exterior, I felt increasingly disconnected from everything happening around me. The evening felt like a performance in which I was simultaneously the star and a member of the audience, watching myself play a role that had been written for me by others. When the time came for toasts, I assumed the evening would follow the traditional pattern. Alexander's father would speak about the joining of families and the continuation of traditions. My father would offer reflections on raising a daughter and welcoming a son-in-law. Perhaps a few close friends would share amusing anecdotes or heartfelt wishes for our future happiness. But as the dinner plates were cleared and guests turned their attention toward the head table, my mother rose from her seat with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. She moved to the microphone with practiced grace, her champagne glass raised, her expression radiating the particular satisfaction that came from orchestrating a successful social event. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the reception hall. "Before we continue with the evening's celebrations, I have a very special announcement to share with all of you." I felt a moment of confusion, followed by the beginning of unease. This deviation from the planned program was unexpected, and my mother was not someone who typically improvised during important social events. The guests turned toward her with polite attention, champagne glasses raised in anticipation of a toast. "As wonderful as tonight has been, as proud as we are of Alexandra and Alexander, I am thrilled to tell you that we have even more reason to celebrate tonight." Her voice carried growing excitement, the kind of barely contained joy that accompanies the sharing of genuinely exciting news. My stomach began to tighten with a premonition I could not yet articulate. Beside me, Alexander shifted slightly, his expression suggesting he was as surprised by this development as I was. My younger daughter, Victoria, has just shared the most wonderful news with the family. She and David are expecting their first child. The words hit like a physical blow. Victoria, my 26-year-old sister, rose from her seat at a nearby table, her face glowing with happiness and pride. David, her husband of 2 years, stood beside her with the expression of a man experiencing one of the most significant moments of his life. The guests erupted in applause and congratulations, their attention immediately shifting from my wedding celebration to this unexpected announcement. But my mother was not finished. "So while we have been celebrating the beginning of Alexandra's married life," she continued, her voice carrying a note of triumph that made my chest constrict with something I could not yet identify as rage, "the real celebration starts now. We are going to be grandparents." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence inside my head, even as the reception hall filled with renewed applause and excited conversation. The real celebration starts now. In a single sentence, my mother had declared that my wedding, my marriage, my supposedly perfect day, was merely the preliminary event before the truly important celebration of my sister's pregnancy. I stood frozen in place, my champagne glass still raised, my expression locked in what I hoped appeared to be happiness and surprise, rather than the devastating humiliation that was flooding through my system. Around me, guests abandoned their seats to surround Victoria and David, offering congratulations and asking excited questions about due dates and gender preferences and nursery plans. Alexander's hand found mine, squeezing gently in what I interpreted as solidarity and support. But when I glanced at his face, I saw that his attention had also turned toward Victoria and the growing crowd of well-wishers surrounding her. Even my own husband was more interested in my sister's news than in providing comfort for the woman whose wedding reception had just been commandeered by someone else's announcement. For several minutes I remained in place, watching my wedding guests celebrate my sister's pregnancy with an enthusiasm and genuine joy that had been notably absent during much of the evening's formal festivities. These same people who had offered polite congratulations on my marriage were now expressing authentic excitement about Victoria's news, asking detailed questions and sharing personal stories about their own experiences with parenthood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The contrast was devastating and illuminating. My marriage represented a social transaction, a joining of families and fortunes, that was respectable and appropriate but not particularly inspiring. Victoria's pregnancy represented new life, future possibilities, genuine emotion and anticipation. My mother moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations with the bearing of someone who had orchestrated a triumph. She had successfully transformed my wedding reception into Victoria's pregnancy announcement party, and she appeared to be thoroughly pleased with the results. The rational part of my mind understood that pregnancy announcements were often spontaneous, that sharing good news during family gatherings was natural and appropriate, that my mother had probably acted from excitement rather than calculated malice. But the rational explanations could not diminish the emotional impact of having my wedding celebration instantly diminished and overshadowed by someone else's news. More devastating was the realization that my mother had felt comfortable making this announcement because she knew it would not cause genuine hardship for me. My wedding was a social event, a beautiful party, an expensive celebration of a marriage that represented security and status rather than passionate love or shared dreams. Victoria's pregnancy announcement represented something more vital and meaningful than anything I had achieved or would achieve through my marriage to Alexander. As the evening progressed, the focus never returned to the original celebration. Conversations centered on Victoria's pregnancy, with guests sharing parenting advice, recommending doctors, and speculating about whether the baby would be a boy or girl. The wedding cake was served, but it felt like an afterthought, a formality that needed to be completed before everyone could return to the more interesting topic of my sister's exciting news. I moved through the remainder of the reception with automatic grace, accepting congratulations that felt perfunctory, participating in conversations that seemed obligatory rather than genuine. Alexander remained beside me, playing his role as attentive new husband, but his engagement also felt dutiful rather than authentic. When the evening finally concluded and the last guests departed, I found myself alone in the bridal suite that had been reserved for our wedding night. Alexander had gone to settle some details with the event coordinator, and I sat in front of the mirror in my wedding dress, looking at a woman I no longer recognized. The face in the mirror belonged to someone who had achieved everything she had been taught to want, and discovered that none of it felt meaningful. The wedding dress that had seemed so beautiful hours earlier now felt like a costume for a role I had been performing, rather than a celebration of my authentic self. I thought about Victoria, glowing with genuine happiness as she shared news that represented a real change in her life, a genuine accomplishment, a future that she and David were creating together. Then I thought about my own future, which consisted primarily of maintaining a lifestyle, attending social events, and fulfilling obligations that had been defined by others. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to acknowledge that I was profoundly unhappy, that the life I had been prepared for and had successfully achieved was not the life I actually wanted to live. But as I sat in that mirror, still wearing my wedding dress, still surrounded by the evidence of a perfectly executed social event, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of allowing myself to collapse under the weight of humiliation and disappointment, instead of accepting that this evening represented the defining moment of my diminished importance in my family and social circle, I chose to smile. Not the brittle, performative smile I had been wearing throughout the evening, but a genuine smile of recognition and possibility. The smile of someone who had just discovered that the life she had been living was not the life she was meant to live, and who was ready to begin the process of discovering what that authentic life might look like. As I finally began to remove my wedding dress, I felt something I had not experienced in years: excitement about an uncertain future, anticipation for challenges I could not yet imagine, and the first stirring of curiosity about what I might be capable of accomplishing if I stopped trying to fulfill other people's expectations and started exploring my own potential. The woman who had walked down the aisle that morning no longer existed. In her place was someone I had never met, but was eager to discover. A woman who would transform public humiliation into private determination, who would use her anger as fuel for creation rather than destruction, and who would discover that the most profound revenge against those who diminish you is not confrontation, but the relentless pursuit of becoming exactly who you were meant to be. The wedding reception was over, but the real celebration was just beginning. The morning after my wedding brought neither the traditional honeymoon glow nor the satisfied exhaustion of a well-executed celebration. Instead, I woke in the master suite of the Whitmore family estate, with a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. Alexander slept peacefully beside me, his breathing steady and untroubled, while I stared at the coffered ceiling and confronted the magnitude of what had been revealed during the previous evening's events. The humiliation of my mother's announcement had stripped away every comfortable illusion I had maintained about my life, my relationships, and my place within my own family. But more than the embarrassment, what consumed my thoughts was the recognition that I had participated willingly in creating a life that required nothing authentic from me. I had excelled at meeting expectations that demanded only compliance, never creativity or genuine contribution. As sunlight filtered through the heavy draperies that had been selected by Alexander's mother according to family tradition, I began to understand that my wedding reception had not been the beginning of something precious being destroyed. It had been the moment when something that was already hollow was finally revealed to be exactly that: beautiful on the surface, empty at its core, maintained through performance rather than sustained by genuine substance. Alexander stirred beside me, reaching automatically for his phone to check the messages that accumulated even during our wedding night. His first words were not expressions of love or reflections on our new marriage, but rather concerns about a business meeting scheduled for later in the week and whether our abbreviated honeymoon would affect his preparation time. "The Peterson account requires more attention than I initially anticipated," he said, scrolling through emails with the focused attention he reserved for financial matters. "We may need to postpone our trip to Napa Valley until next month." I responded with appropriate understanding and flexibility, playing the role of supportive wife who prioritized her husband's professional responsibilities above personal desires. But as I assured him that postponing our honeymoon would not be a problem, I realized I felt no disappointment about the change in plans. The prospect of spending a week touring wineries and luxury resorts with Alexander held no genuine appeal for me. Like everything else in our relationship, it was something I had agreed to because it was expected, rather than something I actually wanted to experience. The realization prompted a question I had never allowed myself to ask. What did I actually want to experience? What would bring me genuine excitement and fulfillment, rather than simply checking another item off the list of appropriate activities for women in my social position? The question remained unanswered as we dressed and prepared for the post-wedding brunch that had been scheduled to continue the celebration with close family members. My mother had arranged the gathering at the country club, creating another opportunity for the families to bond and for her to receive additional recognition for her successful orchestration of the wedding events. But as I selected my outfit for the morning's gathering, I found myself choosing clothing that felt authentic to my preferences rather than appropriate for the occasion. Instead of the pastel dress and pearls that would have been expected, I wore a simple black dress that made me feel competent rather than decorative. The choice was small but significant, representing the first time in months that I had prioritized my own comfort over other people's expectations. The brunch proceeded with the same polished superficiality that had characterized the entire wedding weekend. Conversations focused on reviewing the previous evening's highlights, complimenting various aspects of the celebration, and making plans for future social gatherings. Victoria received continued attention and congratulations regarding her pregnancy announcement, while I observed the dynamic with newly clear eyes. My sister had always occupied a different position within our family structure. 3 years younger and blessed with the kind of natural charm that made social interaction effortless, Victoria had pursued paths that seemed to emerge from her genuine interests, rather than external expectations. She had studied art history because she loved it, worked at a museum because the work felt meaningful to her, and married David because their relationship brought her authentic happiness. Watching her accept congratulations for her pregnancy, I recognized that her joy was real because her choices had been real. She had built a life that reflected her actual values and desires, while I had constructed an existence designed to meet other people's standards for success and appropriateness. The contrast became even more pronounced when Victoria pulled me aside during a lull in the formal brunch activities. "Alexandra, I need to apologize for Mom's announcement last night," she said, her expression showing genuine concern and regret. "I had no idea she was planning to share our news during your reception. David and I specifically asked her to wait until after your wedding celebrations were complete." Her apology was sincere and obviously heartfelt, which made it even more devastating. Victoria had not orchestrated the moment that overshadowed my wedding. She had actually tried to prevent it. My mother had made the decision independently, apparently believing that Victoria's pregnancy was more worthy of celebration than my marriage. "It's not your fault," I replied, and meant it completely. "You have every right to be excited about the pregnancy, and Mom has every right to share in that excitement. But not during your wedding reception," Victoria insisted. "That was your day, your celebration." I'm so sorry it was diminished by our news. The word diminished hung in the air between us, acknowledging what we both understood, but had not explicitly stated. My wedding celebration had been diminished by the pregnancy announcement, not because the announcement was inappropriate, but because my wedding itself lacked the substance and genuine emotion that would have made it impossible to overshadow. "Victoria," I said carefully, "can I ask you something? When you decided to marry David, how did you know it was the right choice?" Quote, she considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised by the unexpected turn in our conversation. "I knew because being with him felt like being the most authentic version of myself," she said finally. "Not a better version, or a more impressive version, but the most real version. Everything felt easier and more natural when we were together, not because there were no challenges, but because we were facing those challenges as a team that genuinely enjoyed each other's company." Her answer illuminated everything that was absent from my own marriage. Alexander and I were compatible in numerous practical ways, but we had never experienced the kind of authentic connection Victoria described. Our relationship was built on shared backgrounds and complementary social positions, rather than genuine affinity for each other as individuals. More significantly, I had never felt like the most authentic version of myself in any context, not just in my marriage but in my entire life. I had become exceptionally skilled at being the version of myself that was most acceptable to others, but I had no clear sense of what my authentic self would look like or want or value. After the brunch concluded and the family obligations were fulfilled, Alexander departed for his office to address the business concerns that could not wait even one additional day. I returned to what was now our shared residence, the elegant townhouse in Richmond's most prestigious neighborhood that had been a wedding gift from his parents. The house was beautiful in the way that significant financial investment could ensure. Every room had been professionally decorated with furniture and artwork selected for their quality and appropriateness, rather than personal significance. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances that I had never learned to use properly. The library contained leather-bound volumes chosen for their appearance rather than their contents. Walking through rooms that were supposed to represent my new life, I felt like a visitor in someone else's home. Nothing reflected my preferences or interests, because I had never developed clear preferences or interests beyond what was considered appropriate for women in my social position. But as I moved through the house, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of my dissatisfaction, I began to feel curious about what my preferences might actually be if I gave myself permission to discover them. In the kitchen, I found myself wondering what it would feel like to prepare meals that reflected my own taste rather than relying on catered events and restaurant dinners. In the library, I considered what books I might choose to read if I selected them based on genuine interest rather than social acceptability. In the spare rooms that had been designated for future children, I imagined what I might create if the space was truly mine to design and use. For the first time in my adult life, I began to consider questions that had nothing to do with external expectations or social obligations. What did I enjoy doing? What problems did I care about solving? What would I create if I had the skills and resources to create anything I wanted? The questions felt both exciting and overwhelming because I had no immediate answers. But the act of asking them represented a fundamental shift in how I was thinking about my life and my future. That evening, as I sat in the elegant living room waiting for Alexander to return from his extended day at the office, I made a decision that would prove to be the first step in a journey I could not yet imagine. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew who had successfully created a life that reflected her authentic values rather than external expectations. My college roommate Jennifer Matthews had graduated with the same degree in literature that I had earned, but she had chosen a completely different path after college. Instead of returning to her family's social circle and marrying appropriately, she had moved to Portland, Oregon, where she worked for a nonprofit organization focused on literacy programs for underserved communities. We had maintained sporadic contact over the years, but our conversations had grown increasingly superficial as our life choices diverged. She had attended my wedding but departed immediately after the ceremony to catch a flight back to Portland, missing the reception and the drama that had unfolded during my mother's announcement. "Alexandra?" Jennifer's voice carried surprise and genuine pleasure when she answered my call. "I was just thinking about you after seeing your wedding photos online. You looked absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I replied, then found myself struggling to articulate the reason for my call. How could I explain that I was questioning everything about the life I had just publicly committed to without sounding ungrateful or unstable? "Jennifer, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret choosing the path you chose after college? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had made more conventional choices?" There was a pause before she responded, but when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of certainty I envied. "I think about it sometimes, but not with regret. I think about it with gratitude that I had the courage to choose authenticity over security, even when that choice seemed risky or unconventional." "What gave you that courage?" "Honestly, the recognition that living someone else's version of a successful life would be a form of slow suicide for me. I realized that I would rather fail at something I cared about than succeed at something that felt meaningless." Her words resonated with an intensity that surprised me. For years, I had been succeeding at things that felt meaningless while never attempting anything that genuinely mattered to me. "Jennifer, what does your work actually involve? What do you do on a typical day?" For the next 30 minutes, she described her role developing literacy programs, working with community partners, and seeing the direct impact of her efforts on families and children who gained access to educational opportunities they had not previously had. Her voice carried enthusiasm and purpose that I had never heard in any conversation about work within my own social circle. "The work isn't always easy," she said, "and I certainly don't have the financial security or social status that many of our college friends have achieved. But I wake up every morning excited about what I'm going to accomplish that day. I go to sleep every night knowing that my work matters to people beyond myself." After we ended the call, I sat in the silence of my beautiful, empty house and confronted the devastating reality that I had never experienced what Jennifer described. I had never woken up excited about accomplishing anything meaningful. I had never gone to sleep knowing that my activities mattered to anyone beyond my immediate social circle. But for the first time, I began to understand that this absence of purpose was not a permanent condition. It was simply the result of choices I had made without fully understanding the alternatives that were available to me. Alexander returned home near midnight, exhausted from his extended workday but satisfied with the progress he had made on various business matters. He kissed me perfunctorily and immediately began discussing his schedule for the following day, which would be equally demanding and would require similar dedication to responsibilities that took precedence over our new marriage. As I listened to his plans and offered appropriate responses, I realized that his priorities were entirely consistent with what I had known about him throughout our relationship. He was not neglecting me or our marriage. He was simply continuing to live according to the values and obligations that had shaped his entire life. The problem was not with Alexander or with the life he was offering me. The problem was that I had agreed to share a life that I did not actually want to live, with a person I respected but did not love in any authentic sense. That night, as I lay beside my new husband in our elegant bedroom, I began to formulate a plan that felt both terrifying and essential. I could not continue living a life that required nothing authentic from me. I could not spend the next 50 years attending social events, managing household staff, and fulfilling obligations that brought me no satisfaction or sense of contribution. But I also understood that I could not simply abandon everything without having something meaningful to pursue instead. The conversation with Jennifer had shown me that alternatives existed, but I needed to discover what specific alternative would align with my own interests and capabilities. I needed to find out who I actually was beneath the carefully constructed persona I had been maintaining for decades. I needed to develop skills that would enable me to contribute something valuable to the world. Most importantly, I needed to discover what I cared about deeply enough to pursue, even when that pursuit required sacrifice and risk. As I finally drifted towards sleep, I made a commitment that would change everything. I would spend the next year exploring possibilities, developing capabilities, and discovering what authentic success might look like for me personally. I had no idea that this commitment would lead me to discover talents I never knew I possessed, build relationships that would become the foundation of a new life, and ultimately create something that would provide both personal fulfillment and meaningful service to others. But I knew with absolute certainty that I could not continue living the life I had just committed to during my wedding ceremony. The woman who had smiled through her sister's pregnancy announcement at her own wedding reception was ready to disappear forever. In her place, someone entirely new was beginning to emerge. Someone who would transform public humiliation into private determination and use that determination to build something extraordinary. The Richmond Public Library had always existed in my peripheral vision as an institution that served other people's needs while remaining irrelevant to my own life. The classical architecture and dignified presence of the building fit appropriately within the city's historic district, but I had never considered it a place where I might find resources relevant to my personal development or professional interests. 3 weeks after my wedding, I found myself climbing the marble steps of the library's main entrance with a sense of purpose I had not experienced in years. The conversation with Jennifer had crystallized my recognition that I needed to explore possibilities beyond the narrow range of activities considered appropriate for women in my social position. But I had no clear understanding of what those possibilities might be, or how to begin investigating them systematically. The reference librarian, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, greeted my inquiry with professional interest rather than the subtle condescension I had learned to expect when discussing topics outside my supposed area of expertise. "I would like to research career opportunities for someone with a liberal arts background," who is interested in making a meaningful contribution to community development, I explained, feeling slightly ridiculous for articulating goals I had never previously considered pursuing. That encompasses quite a broad range of possibilities, she replied thoughtfully. Are you interested in direct service, policy development, organizational management, or perhaps something more entrepreneurial? The question revealed the depth of my ignorance about the professional world beyond the narrow sphere of social and philanthropic activities that had comprised my previous experience. I had never considered the distinctions between different approaches to community service, never understood the various ways someone might contribute to social progress through professional work. I think I need to start with understanding what options exist before I can determine which direction interests me most, I admitted. Over the next 2 hours, the librarian guided me through resources I had never known existed. Professional journals describing innovative approaches to urban development, case studies of successful nonprofit organizations, profiles of social entrepreneurs who had created businesses that addressed community needs while generating sustainable revenue streams. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself completely absorbed in learning about topics that had immediate relevance to questions I genuinely wanted to answer. The material was challenging and required sustained concentration, but I felt energized rather than exhausted by the intellectual effort required to understand complex concepts and their practical applications. One article particularly captured my attention. It described a woman named Sarah Chen who had transformed a struggling neighborhood in Baltimore by developing a network of small businesses that provided essential services while creating local employment opportunities. Her approach combined traditional business principles with community development strategies, creating enterprises that generated profit while addressing social needs. What struck me most about Sarah's story was how she had begun her work without formal training in community development or business management. She had started with genuine concern about problems she observed in her neighborhood, then developed expertise through research, experimentation, and collaboration with others who shared her commitment to finding effective solutions. Reading about her journey, I began to understand that meaningful work was not necessarily something you trained for through traditional educational programs. It could be something you created by identifying problems you genuinely cared about solving and then developing the skills necessary to address those problems effectively. But what problems did I care about solving? What needs had I observed that seemed worthy of sustained attention and effort? The question followed me as I left the library and drove through Richmond's diverse neighborhoods, many of which I had never explored despite having lived in the city for most of my life. My social circle existed within a carefully maintained bubble of privilege that insulated us from direct contact with the economic and social challenges faced by much of the city's population. Now, driving deliberately through areas I had previously avoided or ignored, I began to see Richmond with completely different eyes. I observed neighborhoods where elegant historic architecture had deteriorated due to lack of investment and maintenance. I noticed commercial districts where empty storefronts outnumbered operating businesses. I saw community spaces that appeared underutilized, despite obvious need for gathering places where residents could access services and build social connections. But what captured my attention most was a pattern I noticed in several neighborhoods. Areas that had once been thriving commercial districts still contained beautiful buildings with distinctive architecture. But many of these structures were either empty or being used in ways that did not reflect their potential value to the surrounding community. In the Fan District, I discovered a magnificent Art Deco building that had once housed a department store serving the entire region. The structure was sound and the architectural details were stunning, but it had been divided into storage units that generated minimal revenue while contributing nothing to the neighborhood's vitality. In Jackson Ward, I found a former hotel building that possessed the kind of historic character and strategic location that could anchor community revitalization efforts. But it sat largely empty, while residents in the surrounding area lacked access to meeting spaces, educational resources, and business development support. As I continued my informal survey of underutilized properties, I began to understand that Richmond possessed significant untapped assets in the form of historic buildings that could be transformed into community resources if someone with appropriate skills and commitment chose to undertake such projects. The recognition prompted another library visit, this time focused on learning about historic preservation, adaptive reuse of commercial buildings, and the intersection between real estate development and community development. The research revealed that successful projects typically required expertise in multiple areas, including finance, construction management, regulatory compliance, and community engagement. The scope of knowledge required seemed overwhelming, but I found myself excited rather than intimidated by the learning challenge. For the first time in my life, I was contemplating work that would require me to develop genuine expertise in areas that mattered to me personally. More importantly, I was beginning to identify specific problems I wanted to help solve. Richmond possessed beautiful historic buildings that could serve as anchors for community development, but many of these properties remained underutilized because their redevelopment required more complex financing and planning than typical real estate projects attracted. What if someone developed expertise in the specialized field of historic preservation and community-focused real estate development? What if that person could create a model for transforming underutilized historic properties into community assets that generated both social impact and financial sustainability? The possibility felt both ambitious and achievable, challenging enough to require years of dedicated learning and skill development, but concrete enough to provide clear direction for that learning process. That evening, I attempted to share my emerging interests with Alexander over dinner at the country club, where we maintained a standing reservation for Thursday evenings as part of our regular social routine. I have been researching community development and historic preservation, I began, trying to gauge his reaction to this unexpected development in my interests. I think there might be opportunities to create meaningful projects that combine real estate development with community service. Alexander's response was polite but dismissive, in the way that suggested he viewed my new interests as a harmless hobby rather than serious professional exploration. "That sounds like an interesting way to spend your time," he said, his attention clearly focused on the business conversation taking place at the adjacent table rather than on my attempt to discuss ideas that had become increasingly important to me. "Perhaps you could get involved with the Junior League's Historic Preservation Committee. They always need volunteers for their fundraising events." His suggestion revealed how completely he misunderstood what I was contemplating. I was not interested in volunteering for organizations that raised money for other people to use on projects designed by others. I was interested in developing the capability to design and implement projects that would address problems I had identified and cared about solving. The disconnect between my emerging aspirations and Alexander's understanding of appropriate activities for his wife became increasingly apparent over the following weeks. He supported my library research and neighborhood exploration as healthy diversions that kept me occupied while he focused on his business responsibilities, but he showed no interest in the substance of what I was learning or the possibilities I was beginning to contemplate. Meanwhile, my exploration of Richmond's underutilized historic properties was leading me toward a specific building that seemed to embody both the challenges and opportunities I wanted to address. The Paramount Building, constructed in 1925 as a mixed-use development that included retail space, offices, and residential apartments, occupied a prominent corner location in the heart of what had once been Richmond's most vibrant commercial district. The building's Art Deco facade remained stunning despite years of neglect, and its size and configuration made it suitable for a variety of community-serving uses. But it had sat largely empty for over a decade because previous redevelopment attempts had focused exclusively on maximizing rental income rather than creating sustainable community value. I began spending considerable time researching the building's history, its current ownership situation, and the regulatory requirements that would govern any redevelopment project. The investigation required skills I had never previously developed, but I found the detective work engaging and rewarding in ways that surprised me. Through courthouse records, I learned that the building was owned by an investment group that had purchased it during the real estate downturn with plans to convert it into luxury condominiums. Those plans had been abandoned when market conditions made the project financially unviable, leaving the investors with a property that generated minimal revenue while requiring ongoing maintenance expenses. Through conversations with city planning officials, I discovered that the building's historic designation created both opportunities and constraints for future development. Tax credits were available for preservation projects that met specific criteria, but any redevelopment would need to comply with historic preservation guidelines that limited certain types of modifications. Through interviews with neighborhood residents and business owners, I learned that the community would strongly support a project that brought appropriate commercial and social activities back to the building, but previous developers had never consulted with community stakeholders about their priorities and preferences. The research process was teaching me skills I had never imagined needing: how to interpret legal documents, how to understand construction and zoning regulations, how to conduct informal market research through community conversations, how to analyze financial projections for complex real estate projects. But more than the technical skills, I was developing something I had never possessed before: a sense of professional confidence based on genuine expertise, rather than social positioning. The knowledge I was acquiring felt substantial and valuable, relevant to solving real problems that mattered to people beyond my immediate social circle. After 2 months of research, I had developed enough understanding of the Paramount Building situation to recognize that it represented exactly the kind of opportunity I wanted to pursue. The project would require significant capital investment, extensive regulatory approval processes, and careful coordination between multiple stakeholders. But it was feasible if approached with appropriate expertise and community support. More importantly, the project could serve as a model for similar developments throughout the region, demonstrating how historic preservation could be combined with community development to create sustainable social enterprises that generated both economic and social returns on investment. But pursuing such a project would require capabilities I did not yet possess, and commitments that would fundamentally change my relationship with Alexander and my position within Richmond's social hierarchy. I needed to develop expertise in areas including construction management, project finance, regulatory compliance, and community engagement. I needed to build relationships with professionals who could provide guidance and collaboration throughout the development process. Most significantly, I needed to commit to years of sustained work that would require time, energy, and attention that I was currently dedicating to social obligations and family expectations. The decision to pursue this path would mean acknowledging that my marriage to Alexander was not providing the kind of partnership and support I needed for meaningful professional development. It would mean disappointing family members who expected me to focus on traditional roles rather than ambitious career goals. It would mean risking failure at work that mattered to me more than anything I had ever attempted before. But as I stood in front of the Paramount Building on a crisp October afternoon, looking at the magnificent facade that could be restored to its original beauty while housing activities that would serve the surrounding community, I felt something I had never experienced before in any aspect of my life. I felt called to this work in a way that made all the risks and challenges seem not only acceptable but essential. I felt ready to become someone I had never been before, someone capable of creating something meaningful that would exist long after I was gone. The woman who had smiled through her sister's pregnancy announcement at her own wedding reception was finally ready to disappear completely. In her place was emerging someone who understood that authentic success was not measured by social approval or financial security, but by the courage to pursue work that aligned with your deepest values and contributed to something larger than your own comfort and status. The foundation assessment was complete. I knew what I wanted to build, and I was ready to begin developing the skills necessary to build it well. The Community Development Workshop held at Virginia Commonwealth University represented the first time I had entered an academic environment as someone seeking practical skills rather than fulfilling social expectations. The registration process itself had been revelatory, requiring me to articulate my professional goals and previous experience in ways that exposed how little substantive background I possessed in any field relevant to meaningful work. Under the section requesting information about current employment, I had written, quote, "community development research," without specifying that this research consisted entirely of independent library visits and neighborhood surveys, rather than formal professional engagement. The description felt simultaneously misleading and accurate, reflecting my transitional position between the woman I had been and the professional I hoped to become. The workshop attracted 60 participants representing diverse backgrounds and career stages. Urban planners working for municipal governments sat alongside nonprofit executives managing community service organizations. Graduate students pursuing degrees in public administration discussed projects with seasoned real estate developers who specialized in affordable housing construction. Social entrepreneurs, who had launched successful businesses addressing community needs, shared tables with foundation program officers who evaluated grant proposals for community development initiatives. I had never found myself in a professional environment where my social background and family connections provided no particular advantages or recognition. Nobody inquired about my family's business interests or social affiliations. Instead, conversations focused exclusively on professional experience, project outcomes, and technical expertise relevant to community development challenges. The anonymity felt both uncomfortable and liberating. Without the familiar markers of social status that typically defined my interactions with others, I was forced to engage based solely on my genuine interests and the knowledge I was developing through independent research. The workshop's first session focused on successful models of historic preservation combined with community economic development. The presenter, Dr. Marcus Williams from the University of Virginia's School of Architecture, described case studies from cities across the Southeast, where abandoned historic buildings had been transformed into community assets that generated both social impact and financial sustainability. His presentation included detailed analysis of financing structures, regulatory approval processes, community engagement strategies, and long-term operational models that supported ongoing success. The material was technically complex and required sustained concentration to understand the relationships between different project components, but I found myself completely absorbed by the content in ways I had never experienced during my formal education. More significantly, Dr. Williams' examples directly relevant to the possibilities I had been researching regarding the Paramount Building. His case studies demonstrated that projects similar to what I was contemplating had been successfully implemented in comparable contexts, providing concrete evidence that my emerging professional interests could translate into viable development opportunities. During the lunch break, I approached Dr. Williams to discuss the applicability of his research to Richmond's specific context and challenges. The conversation revealed that he was familiar with Richmond's historic architecture and had previously consulted on preservation projects within the city, though he had not worked on any developments that combined historic preservation with comprehensive community development goals. The Paramount Building represents exactly the kind of opportunity where thoughtful development could create significant community impact, he said after I described my preliminary research regarding the property. But success would require careful attention to financing, community engagement, and operational planning from the earliest stages of the project. His assessment confirmed my understanding that pursuing the Paramount Building development would require expertise I did not yet possess. But it also validated my belief that the project represented a realistic opportunity rather than an unrealistic aspiration. More importantly, Dr. Williams offered practical guidance regarding next steps for developing the knowledge and relationships necessary to pursue such projects effectively. You should consider joining the Virginia Association for Community Development, he suggested. The organization provides professional development opportunities and networking connections that would be valuable for someone entering this field. Additionally, you might benefit from shadowing experienced developers who specialize in similar projects. The afternoon sessions focused on community engagement strategies and stakeholder management for development projects. The presenter, Maria Santos, directed a nonprofit organization in Norfolk that specialized in facilitating community-led development initiatives. Her approach emphasized the importance of building genuine partnerships with neighborhood residents and existing businesses, rather than simply consulting with community stakeholders about predetermined development plans. Successful community development requires authentic collaboration throughout the entire project lifecycle, she explained. Community members must be involved as partners in identifying priorities, designing solutions, and implementing programs, rather than merely being consulted about proposals created by outside developers. Her perspective challenged assumptions I had unconsciously maintained about development processes. My research had focused primarily on technical aspects of historic preservation and financial structures for complex real estate projects, but I had not adequately considered the community engagement components that would be essential for creating sustainable social impact. Maria's presentation included examples of projects that had failed despite strong financial planning and technical execution, because developers had not invested sufficient time and attention in building authentic community support. Conversely, she described initiatives that had succeeded despite modest financial resources because they had emerged from genuine community priorities and maintained broad neighborhood support throughout implementation and operation. The contrast highlighted gaps in my understanding of community development that extended beyond technical knowledge to encompass relationship-building skills and collaborative approaches to problem-solving that I had never needed to develop within my previous social and professional contexts. During the workshop's final session, participants were organized into small groups to discuss specific project concepts and receive feedback from peers with relevant experience. I found myself assigned to a table with 5 other participants, whose backgrounds and current projects provided immediate relevance to my emerging interests. Sarah Kim managed real estate development for a community land trust in Charlottesville that specialized in creating affordable housing within historic neighborhoods. Her work required expertise in preservation techniques, community financing models, and regulatory compliance procedures that directly applicable to the challenges I would face with the Paramount Building project. David Rodriguez directed operations for a business incubator in Alexandria that provided workspace and support services for social entrepreneurs developing community-serving enterprises. His experience included facility management, program development, and partnership coordination that related to my vision for transforming the Paramount Building into a hub for community-focused businesses and services. Jennifer Liu worked as a project manager for a construction company that specialized in historic renovation projects throughout Virginia. Her technical expertise in preservation construction and regulatory approval processes addressed knowledge gaps that I recognized as critical for successful project implementation. Marcus Thompson served as Economic Development Coordinator for Petersburg, where his responsibilities included identifying and supporting redevelopment opportunities that could strengthen local business districts while preserving neighborhood character. His perspective on municipal policy and community engagement provided insights into governmental relationships that would be essential for navigating the regulatory requirements associated with the Paramount Building. Finally, Rebecca Foster operated a social enterprise consulting firm that helped organizations develop sustainable business models for community-serving programs. Her expertise in financial planning and operational design for mission-driven organizations addressed strategic questions that I had not yet begun to consider regarding long-term management of community development projects. The diversity of expertise represented within our discussion group created an opportunity for collaborative learning that exceeded anything I had experienced through independent research. Each participant contributed perspectives that enhanced my understanding of different aspects of community development work, while providing practical guidance regarding specific challenges I would need to address. More importantly, the conversation revealed that successful community development typically required collaborative approaches that brought together professionals with complementary skills, rather than individual expertise in all relevant areas. The complexity of projects like the Paramount Building development made partnership relationships essential rather than merely beneficial for achieving sustainable outcomes. When I described my preliminary research regarding the Paramount Building, the group's response exceeded my expectations in terms of both enthusiasm and practical support. Rather than viewing my project as competition for limited resources or attention, they saw it as an opportunity for potential collaboration and mutual support. Sarah offered to share financing models and regulatory templates that could be adapted for Richmond's specific context. David suggested possibilities for coordinating programming between the Paramount Building and his business incubator to create cross-promotional opportunities and shared resources. Jennifer provided contact information for construction contractors and preservation specialists who could contribute to project planning and implementation. Marcus described municipal incentive programs that might be applicable to the Paramount Building development and offered to facilitate introductions to Richmond officials who manage similar initiatives. Rebecca suggested frameworks for developing sustainable operational models and offered to provide consultation regarding business planning and organizational development as the project progressed. By the end of the workshop, I had not only gained valuable knowledge regarding community development principles and practices, but I had also begun building a professional network of individuals who possessed expertise relevant to my emerging career interests and who were willing to provide ongoing support and collaboration. The experience represented a fundamental shift in how I approached professional relationships and career development. Rather than relying on family connections and social positioning to access opportunities, I was building relationships based on shared professional interests and complementary capabilities that could support mutual success. The networking approach felt both more authentic and more productive than the social relationship strategies I had employed throughout my previous adult life. Conversations focused on substantive topics rather than superficial pleasantries, and connections were based on potential for meaningful collaboration rather than social obligation or reciprocal entertainment. 2 weeks after the workshop, I attended my first Virginia Association for Community Development meeting, where I encountered additional professionals whose work related to my interests and who could provide guidance regarding career development in community-focused fields. The meeting included a presentation by Thomas Chen, who directed a foundation that provided grants for historic preservation projects throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. His presentation described funding opportunities specifically designed to support community development initiatives that combined historic preservation with economic development goals. The information directly applicable to the Paramount Building project, but more importantly, Thomas's foundation represented a potential source of both financial support and technical assistance that could significantly enhance the project's feasibility and impact. During the networking portion of the meeting, I introduced myself to Thomas and described my preliminary research regarding the Paramount Building development. His response indicated genuine interest in the project concept and willingness to provide guidance regarding grant application processes and project development strategies. We are always looking for projects that demonstrate innovative approaches to combining preservation with community development, he explained. The Paramount Building sounds like it could be an excellent candidate for our Community Impact Grant program, particularly if the development plan includes significant community engagement components and measurable social outcomes. His encouragement provided additional validation for my project concept while also introducing specific opportunities for financial support that could make the development financially viable despite its ambitious community service components. More importantly, the conversation led to an invitation to visit other foundation-supported projects that had successfully combined historic preservation with community development goals. These site visits would provide practical examples of successful implementation strategies, while offering opportunities to learn from experienced practitioners who had navigated similar challenges. Over the following month, I participated in 3 site visits that dramatically expanded my understanding of what successful community development projects could accomplish and how they could be structured to achieve both social impact and financial sustainability. The first visit took me to Staunton, where a former department store had been transformed into a community center that housed a farmers market, business incubator, and educational programming space. The project had been developed through a partnership between the city government, a local foundation, and a community development corporation that specialized in neighborhood revitalization initiatives. The Staunton project demonstrated how historic preservation could be combined with programming that addressed specific community needs while generating revenue streams that supported ongoing operations. The farmers market provided affordable access to fresh produce while supporting local agricultural businesses. The business incubator offered workspace and support services for entrepreneurs developing community-serving enterprises. The educational programming created opportunities for skills development and cultural enrichment that strengthened neighborhood social connections. The second visit brought me to Fredericksburg, where a former textile mill had been converted into affordable artist housing combined with gallery space and community workshops. The project had been financed through a combination of historic preservation tax credits, foundation grants, and community investment funds that enabled below-market rents while supporting sustainable operations. The Fredericksburg project illustrated how creative approaches to programming and financing could make community development projects viable in contexts where traditional real estate development would not generate sufficient returns on investment. The combination of affordable housing, cultural programming, and community engagement created multiple value streams that supported both individual artists and broader neighborhood vitality. The third visit took me to Petersburg, where Marcus Thompson had coordinated the redevelopment of a former hotel into a mixed-use facility that included retail space, office suites, and community meeting rooms. The project had been structured as a partnership between private investors, municipal government, and neighborhood organizations that shared both financial returns and decision-making authority. The Petersburg project demonstrated how community engagement could be integrated into project governance rather than being limited to consultation during planning phases. Community representatives served on the project's board of directors and had ongoing influence over programming decisions, tenant selection, and operational policies. These site visits provided concrete examples of successful implementation strategies while also introducing me to practitioners who became valuable mentors and advisors for my own project development efforts. Each project coordinator offered practical guidance regarding specific challenges I would face while also providing ongoing consultation and support as my plans for the Paramount Building development became more detailed and sophisticated. By the end of my 4th month of professional development activities, I had built a network of relationships that extended far beyond Richmond's social elite to encompass professionals throughout Virginia and the broader Mid-Atlantic region who specialized in community development work. These relationships provided access to expertise, resources, and opportunities that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional social connections or independent research efforts. More importantly, I had begun to understand that meaningful professional work required collaborative approaches that emphasized mutual support and shared success rather than individual achievement and competitive advantage. The community development field attracted professionals who were motivated by social impact rather than personal recognition, and who understood that sustainable change required partnership relationships that transcended traditional organizational and geographic boundaries. The transformation in my professional relationships reflected broader changes in how I understood success, achievement, and personal fulfillment. Rather than measuring progress through social recognition or comparative advantage over others, I was learning to evaluate success through contribution to shared goals and positive impact on community well-being. The woman who had smiled through her sister's pregnancy announcement was continuing to disappear, replaced by someone who understood that authentic success required commitment to work that served purposes larger than individual comfort and status. The network of relationships I was building would become the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything I had previously imagined possible. The acceptance letter from Virginia Commonwealth University's Historic Preservation Certificate program arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after my wedding and 4 months into what had become an increasingly systematic campaign to acquire the professional expertise necessary for meaningful community development work. The program represented the first formal educational commitment I had made, based entirely on my own professional interests rather than family expectations or social obligations. The certificate program had been designed for working professionals seeking specialized knowledge in historic preservation principles, regulatory frameworks, and project management techniques. The curriculum included coursework in architectural history, preservation planning, construction management, and the intersection between historic preservation and economic development. Classes met 2 evenings per week and required completion of a supervised practicum project that demonstrated practical application of theoretical knowledge. Enrolling in the program represented a significant commitment of time and intellectual energy that would necessarily reduce my availability for the social obligations that had previously consumed most of my discretionary time. Alexander had responded to my academic plans with polite support that masked obvious bewilderment regarding my motivation for pursuing formal education in a field he considered tangentially relevant to my social position and family responsibilities. The disconnect between my emerging professional interests and Alexander's understanding of appropriate activities for his wife had become increasingly apparent throughout the months since our wedding. He supported my library research and professional networking as healthy diversions that demonstrated intellectual curiosity, but he showed no comprehension of my intention to translate this interest into substantial professional commitments that would compete with traditional family and social obligations. The first evening of classes introduced me to 23 other students, whose backgrounds and motivations for pursuing historic preservation expertise varied considerably, but shared common elements of professional purpose and commitment to meaningful work that I had rarely encountered within my previous social and educational contexts. Margaret Chen worked as an architect specializing in adaptive reuse projects for nonprofit organizations throughout Virginia. Her enrollment in the program reflected her recognition that successful preservation projects required understanding of regulatory frameworks and financing mechanisms that extended beyond architectural design considerations. Robert Williams managed facilities for the Virginia Museum System and needed preservation expertise to support long-term stewardship of historic buildings that housed valuable collections while serving public educational missions. Patricia Davis served as Economic Development Coordinator for Lynchburg, where her responsibilities included identifying and supporting preservation projects that could contribute to downtown revitalization efforts, while maintaining neighborhood character and affordability. James Mitchell operated a construction company that specialized in historic renovation projects and sought formal credentials that would enhance his ability to compete for preservation contracts, while ensuring compliance with complex regulatory requirements. The diversity of professional backgrounds represented within the program created opportunities for collaborative learning that exceeded the traditional academic model of individual knowledge acquisition. Class discussions frequently evolved into collaborative problem-solving sessions, where students with complementary expertise addressed real-world challenges that multiple participants faced in their professional work. More importantly, the program's emphasis on practical application meant that theoretical knowledge was immediately tested through hands-on projects that required integration of multiple skill areas. Rather than studying historic preservation as an abstract academic subject, we learned by working on actual buildings that presented authentic challenges requiring creative solutions and careful execution. The first major assignment required each student to conduct a comprehensive assessment of a historic building's condition, develop a preservation plan that addressed identified structural and aesthetic issues, and prepare cost estimates for recommended interventions. The project demanded research skills for understanding the building's history and architectural significance, technical knowledge for evaluating structural conditions and preservation options, and analytical capabilities for developing realistic implementation strategies. I selected the Paramount Building as my project focus, recognizing that the academic assignment provided an ideal opportunity to develop detailed knowledge regarding the property that had become central to my emerging professional aspirations. The selection also allowed me to contribute meaningfully to class discussions by sharing insights gained through months of independent research regarding the building's history, ownership situation, and redevelopment potential. The assessment process required skills I had never previously needed to develop but found surprisingly engaging and rewarding. I learned to interpret architectural drawings and construction documents, understand structural engineering reports, and evaluate mechanical systems for functionality and efficiency. I developed capabilities in photographic documentation, measurement techniques, and written analysis that translated technical findings into accessible recommendations for non-specialist audiences. The technical learning was supported by broader coursework in preservation theory and practice that provided conceptual frameworks for understanding how individual building projects related to larger community development goals and historical preservation objectives. Rather than viewing the Paramount Building as an isolated real estate opportunity, I began to understand how its redevelopment could contribute to broader patterns of neighborhood revitalization and cultural heritage protection. Professor Elizabeth Morrison, who directed the certificate program, brought 30 years of experience in preservation planning and had worked on landmark projects throughout the Southeast. Her approach to instruction emphasized the integration of technical expertise with community engagement skills and policy analysis capabilities that were essential for successful preservation advocacy and project implementation. During individual consultation sessions, Professor Morrison provided guidance that extended beyond the technical requirements of coursework to encompass career development strategies and professional relationship building that would support long-term success in preservation-related fields. Your background in research and analysis provides an excellent foundation for preservation work, she observed during our November meeting. But success in this field requires the ability to build consensus among diverse stakeholders who often have conflicting priorities and limited understanding of preservation principles and processes. Her assessment highlighted skill areas where I needed additional development beyond the technical knowledge provided through formal coursework. Community engagement, stakeholder management, and collaborative problem-solving required interpersonal capabilities that I had not systematically developed despite years of social interaction within Richmond's elite circles. The social skills I had developed for navigating country club conversations and charity fundraising events were not directly applicable to building trust with neighborhood residents, coordinating between municipal officials and community advocates, or facilitating productive discussions among stakeholders with fundamentally different perspectives on development priorities and community needs. Professor Morrison recommended that I seek additional training in facilitation techniques and community engagement methodologies through workshops offered by the Virginia Community Development Corporation Association. She also suggested volunteer opportunities with local preservation organizations that would provide practical experience in stakeholder coordination and advocacy strategy development. The winter semester introduced advanced coursework in project finance and regulatory compliance that addressed knowledge gaps I had identified as critical for pursuing the Paramount building development. The material was technically complex and required sustained concentration to understand the relationships between different funding sources, approval processes, and implementation requirements. Historic preservation tax credits provided federal and state incentives for projects that met specific criteria regarding architectural authenticity and public accessibility. Community development block grants offered municipal funding for projects that demonstrated measurable social impact and neighborhood benefit. Foundation grants supported initiatives that aligned with particular philanthropic priorities and demonstrated sustainable operational models. Understanding how these different funding mechanisms could be combined to support comprehensive redevelopment projects required analytical skills similar to those I had developed during my liberal arts education, but applied to practical challenges with real-world consequences rather than theoretical academic exercises. The complexity of financing structures initially seemed overwhelming, but I discovered that systematic research and careful analysis could make even complicated projects comprehensible and manageable. The key was breaking large challenges into component parts and developing expertise in each area, rather than attempting to understand entire systems simultaneously. My approach to mastering preservation finance involved creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked different funding sources, their requirements and restrictions, application deadlines, and compatibility with other funding mechanisms. The systematic organization allowed me to understand how various pieces could be combined to support projects of different scales and community impact levels. The analytical work was supported by practical exercises that required students to develop complete financing proposals for actual preservation projects. Working with real buildings and authentic constraints forced us to move beyond theoretical understanding to practical problem solving that accounted for political considerations, community priorities, and implementation challenges that were not addressed in academic literature. My financing proposal for the Paramount building development demonstrated how historic preservation tax credits could be combined with community development grants and foundation support to create a sustainable model for transforming the building into a community resource that generated both social impact and modest financial returns for investors. The proposal included detailed cost estimates for construction work, projected revenue streams from rental income and fee-for-service programming, and operational budgets that accounted for ongoing maintenance, insurance, and administrative expenses. The analysis showed that the project could achieve financial sustainability while maintaining affordable rents and community programming that served neighborhood priorities. More importantly, the financing proposal provided a realistic roadmap for actually pursuing the Paramount building development, rather than simply conceptualizing it as an interesting possibility. The document included specific action steps, timeline requirements, and stakeholder engagement processes that could guide project implementation from initial planning through construction completion and operational launch. Spring semester coursework focused on construction management and regulatory compliance procedures that would be essential for successful project implementation. The material covered building codes, accessibility requirements, environmental regulations, and historic preservation standards that governed renovation work on properties listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The regulatory framework was complex and required careful attention to ensure that proposed modifications would comply with preservation standards while meeting contemporary building codes and accessibility requirements. Balancing historical authenticity with functional modernization often required creative solutions that satisfied multiple regulatory authorities with different priorities and evaluation criteria. The construction management component addressed project oversight, contractor selection, quality control, and budget management throughout renovation processes that could extend over multiple years and involve numerous specialized trades and preservation techniques. I learned to read and interpret construction documents, understand sequencing requirements for complex renovation work, and coordinate between architects, engineers, contractors, and regulatory officials whose involvement was necessary for successful project completion. The practical learning was supported by site visits to active preservation projects, where we observed construction techniques, met with project managers, and discussed challenges and solutions with experienced practitioners who had successfully completed similar developments. One particularly valuable site visit took us to Norfolk, where a former department store was being converted into affordable housing, with ground-floor retail space and community meeting rooms. The project demonstrated how preservation principles could be applied to create contemporary functionality while maintaining historical character and architectural integrity. The Norfolk project manager, Susan Chen, had completed the VCU preservation program 5 years earlier and was implementing exactly the kind of comprehensive community development approach that I hoped to pursue with the Paramount building. During our tour of the construction site, Susan described challenges she had encountered and strategies she had developed for managing complex stakeholder relationships, coordinating regulatory approval processes, and maintaining community support throughout the extended construction period. The technical aspects of preservation work can be learned through formal education and supervised experience, she explained. But success ultimately depends on your ability to build trust with community members and maintain that trust through inevitable complications and delays that arise during any major construction project. Her perspective reinforced Professor Morrison's earlier observation about the importance of community engagement skills for successful preservation work. Technical expertise was necessary but not sufficient for projects that aimed to create sustainable community impact, rather than simply profitable real estate development. The spring semester also included a required practicum component that allowed students to apply classroom learning through supervised work on actual preservation projects. I arranged to complete my practicum requirement through volunteer work with the Historic Richmond Foundation, where I contributed to planning efforts for the redevelopment of several underutilized historic properties throughout the city. The practicum work provided practical experience in community engagement, stakeholder coordination, and project planning that complemented the technical knowledge gained through formal coursework. I learned to facilitate community meetings, prepare presentation materials for diverse audiences, and coordinate between property owners, neighborhood representatives, and municipal officials whose cooperation was essential for successful project approval and implementation. More importantly, the practicum experience introduced me to Richmond residents and community leaders whose perspectives on neighborhood development priorities differed significantly from assumptions I had maintained based on my previous social isolation within elite circles. Through community meetings in Jackson Ward, I learned that longtime residents were concerned about preservation projects that might accelerate gentrification processes and displace affordable housing and local businesses that provided essential services to neighborhood families. Through discussions with Churchill business owners, I discovered that successful commercial development required careful attention to parking availability, pedestrian accessibility, and complementary relationships with existing enterprises rather than competition for limited customer bases. Through conversations with Fan District homeowners, I understood that community support for preservation projects depended heavily on demonstrated commitment to maintaining neighborhood character while addressing legitimate concerns about increased traffic, noise, and other impacts associated with expanded commercial activity. These community engagement experiences taught me that successful preservation work required genuine partnership with neighborhood stakeholders, rather than simply consultation about predetermined development plans. Community members needed to be involved as collaborators in identifying priorities, designing solutions, and implementing programs that would serve their needs and reflect their values. By the completion of the certificate program in August, I had developed technical expertise in historic preservation principles and practices, gained practical experience in project planning and community engagement, and created a detailed development proposal for the Paramount building that demonstrated the integration of preservation objectives with community development goals. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I possessed the intellectual capability and sustained commitment necessary for meaningful professional work that required continuous learning, collaborative problem-solving, and persistent attention to complex challenges with real-world consequences. The woman who had enrolled in the preservation program 8 months earlier primarily to acquire credentials that might enhance her credibility for community development work had been transformed through the learning process into someone who understood that expertise was not a destination, but an ongoing journey of skill development and knowledge acquisition that would continue throughout her career. The skills I had acquired provided the foundation for pursuing the Paramount building development, but they also revealed the extent of additional learning that would be necessary for success in community development work that aspired to create lasting positive impact rather than simply profitable real estate transactions. I was ready to begin the next phase of my transformation, from disconnected socialite to engaged community development practitioner, armed with genuine expertise and authentic relationships that could support ambitious projects designed to serve purposes larger than individual financial gain or social recognition. The conference room at Richmond City Hall contained the kind of institutional furnishing and fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to drain optimism from even the most enthusiastic development proposals. As I arranged my presentation materials across the worn conference table, I confronted the reality that the next 90 minutes would determine whether 8 months of research, education, and relationship building would translate into approval for the most ambitious project I had ever attempted to pursue. The Paramount Building redevelopment proposal represented the culmination of everything I had learned through the Historic Preservation Certificate Program, the professional network I had developed through community development workshops and site visits, and the community engagement skills I had acquired through volunteer work with neighborhood organizations throughout Richmond. The proposal itself was comprehensive in scope and detailed in execution. The document included architectural plans for adaptive reuse that would preserve the building's Art Deco character while creating flexible spaces suitable for community programming, small business incubation, and affordable meeting facilities. Financial projections demonstrated how historic preservation tax credits could be combined with community development grants and foundation funding to achieve sustainable operations while maintaining affordable access for neighborhood residents and community organizations. The community engagement component outlined partnerships with existing neighborhood groups, local business associations, and cultural organizations that would provide programming and ensure that the redevelopment served authentic community priorities rather than imposed external development objectives. Letters of support from 12 different community organizations confirmed genuine neighborhood enthusiasm for the project and commitment to ongoing collaboration throughout implementation and operation phases. The regulatory compliance section addressed building codes, accessibility requirements, environmental considerations, and historic preservation standards that would govern renovation work. The construction timeline accounted for permitting delays, weather constraints, and coordination requirements between multiple specialized contractors whose work would be necessary for successful project completion. The proposal had been refined through consultations with the professional network I had developed, reviewed by preservation experts and community development practitioners who had identified potential challenges and suggested improvements, and tested through presentations to community groups who had provided feedback regarding programming priorities and operational preferences. Despite the thorough preparation, I understood that approval would depend heavily on factors beyond the technical merits of the proposal itself. Municipal officials needed to balance community development objectives with budget constraints, political considerations, and competing demands for limited resources and staff attention. The project's success would require not only technical feasibility but also political viability and administrative support that could sustain momentum through inevitable complications and delays. The meeting participants represented diverse perspectives and priorities that would need to be addressed through the presentation and subsequent discussion. Maria Santos, the Director of Community Development, had expressed initial enthusiasm for projects that combined historic preservation with neighborhood economic development, but needed to ensure that any approved initiatives could be implemented within existing departmental resources and capabilities. Robert Chen, the Historic Preservation Officer, supported adaptive reuse projects that demonstrated authentic commitment to preservation principles but required assurance that proposed modifications would comply with National Register standards and maintain the building's architectural integrity and historical significance. Patricia Williams, representing the Department of Planning and Development Review, needed confirmation that the project would comply with zoning requirements, parking regulations, and infrastructure capacity limitations that could affect neighborhood traffic patterns and municipal service delivery. James Mitchell from the Economic Development Authority sought evidence that the project would generate measurable economic benefits for the surrounding neighborhood, while creating sustainable employment opportunities and supporting existing local businesses rather than competing with established enterprises. The community representatives included Dorothy Jefferson from the Jackson Ward Neighborhood Association, whose primary concerns focused on ensuring that redevelopment would benefit longtime residents rather than accelerating gentrification processes that might displace affordable housing and community-serving businesses. Marcus Thompson, representing the Churchill Business Alliance, wanted assurance that increased commercial activity would complement existing enterprises and contribute to coordinated marketing efforts that could strengthen the entire commercial district rather than fragmenting customer bases and community resources. The complexity of stakeholder interests and regulatory requirements had been anticipated through months of preliminary discussions with each participant, but the formal presentation represented the first comprehensive review of the complete proposal and the initial opportunity for collaborative evaluation of project feasibility and community benefit. My presentation began with historical context that established the Paramount Building's architectural significance and its previous role as an anchor for commercial activity that had supported neighborhood economic vitality throughout the mid-20th century. The historical analysis demonstrated how the building's decline had paralleled broader patterns of disinvestment that had affected the surrounding neighborhood and created opportunities for thoughtful redevelopment that could contribute to coordinated revitalization efforts. The architectural section included detailed drawings, showing how the building's original layout could be adapted to contemporary uses while preserving character-defining features and maintaining historical authenticity. The proposed modifications addressed accessibility requirements through solutions that enhanced functionality without compromising architectural integrity, incorporated energy efficiency improvements that would reduce operational costs while respecting preservation standards, and created flexible spaces that could accommodate diverse programming needs throughout different seasons and community priorities. The financial analysis presented funding strategies that combined multiple sources to achieve project feasibility, while minimizing municipal investment requirements and ensuring sustainable long-term operations. Historic preservation tax credits would offset approximately 40% of construction costs. Community development block grants would support infrastructure improvements and accessibility modifications, and foundation grants would fund programming development and community engagement activities during the initial operational period. The revenue projections included conservative estimates for rental income from small business tenants, fee-for-service programming such as event hosting and meeting space rental, and collaborative partnerships with existing community organizations that would share space and programming costs, while expanding service capacity and community reach. The community engagement section outlined ongoing partnerships that would ensure neighborhood residents maintained meaningful influence over programming decisions, tenant selection processes, and operational policies throughout the project's development and implementation phases. The governance structure included community representation on the project's advisory board and formal mechanisms for ongoing feedback and collaborative problem-solving that would address concerns or conflicts that might emerge during construction or operational phases. The presentation concluded with implementation timelines that accounted for regulatory approval processes, funding application requirements, construction sequencing, and community engagement activities that would maintain neighborhood support and involvement throughout the project's development, from planning approval through operational launch and ongoing management. The initial response from meeting participants indicated genuine interest in the project concept and appreciation for the thoroughness of preparation and community engagement that had informed proposal development. However, the discussion also revealed specific concerns and additional requirements that would need to be addressed before formal approval could be granted. Maria Santos expressed enthusiasm for the project's potential to serve as a model for future community development initiatives, but needed additional analysis regarding operational sustainability and municipal support requirements during the initial implementation period. The city's limited staffing and budget constraints meant that approved projects needed to demonstrate genuine self-sufficiency rather than requiring ongoing administrative support or financial assistance beyond the initial development phase. Robert Chen appreciated the attention to preservation principles and architectural authenticity, but required more detailed specifications regarding construction techniques and materials that would be used for restoration work. The National Register standards demanded documentation that proposed interventions would be reversible, compatible with original construction methods, and distinguishable from historical fabric while maintaining overall architectural coherence and character. Patricia Williams identified potential challenges regarding parking availability and traffic management that would need to be addressed through coordination with the Department of Public Works and consultation with surrounding property owners who might be affected by increased commercial activity and community programming that could generate additional vehicle and pedestrian traffic during evening and weekend hours. James Mitchell supported the economic development objectives but requested additional market analysis demonstrating that proposed programming and tenant recruitment strategies would complement rather than compete with existing businesses and contribute to coordinated promotional efforts that could benefit the entire commercial district, rather than fragmenting limited customer bases and community resources. The community representatives expressed cautious optimism about the project's potential benefits but emphasized the importance of maintaining affordable access and preventing displacement pressures that had resulted from previous development projects that had initially promised community benefit but ultimately served primarily external economic interests rather than neighborhood residents and existing local businesses. Dorothy Jefferson specifically requested stronger commitments regarding affordable space allocation and formal mechanisms for community oversight that would ensure ongoing accountability to neighborhood priorities, rather than allowing programming and operational decisions to be made without adequate community input or influence throughout the project's long-term development and management. Marcus Thompson suggested coordination opportunities with existing business promotion activities and seasonal events that could enhance the project's community integration while supporting established enterprises through collaborative marketing efforts and cross-promotional activities that would benefit both new and existing commercial activities within the broader neighborhood context. The discussion revealed that approval would require addressing these specific concerns through proposal modifications and additional documentation that demonstrated genuine commitment to community benefit and sustainable operations, while maintaining compliance with regulatory requirements and preservation standards. Rather than viewing these requirements as obstacles to project approval, I recognize them as opportunities to strengthen the proposal through more detailed planning and enhanced community partnerships that would ultimately improve project outcomes and long-term sustainability. The meeting concluded with agreement that I would prepare supplementary materials addressing the identified concerns and present revised proposals to individual departments for technical review before returning for final approval consideration. The timeline allowed 6 weeks for proposal refinement and stakeholder consultation, with final approval considerations scheduled for early October. The challenge represented exactly the kind of complex problem-solving opportunity that had motivated my transition from social obligations to meaningful professional work. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the additional requirements, I felt energized by the prospect of developing creative solutions that could address diverse stakeholder concerns while advancing community development objectives that aligned with my personal values and professional aspirations. The following weeks involved intensive collaboration with the professional network I had developed through months of workshops, site visits, and preservation program connections. Each concern raised during the municipal presentation required specialized expertise and creative problem-solving that drew upon different aspects of the knowledge and relationships I had been building throughout my transition, from disconnected socialite to engaged community development practitioner. Sarah Kim provided guidance regarding sustainable financing models and operational structures that had proven successful in similar projects throughout Virginia. Her experience with community land trusts and cooperative ownership models suggested approaches that could address concerns about long-term affordability and community control while maintaining financial viability and regulatory compliance. Jennifer Liu contributed technical expertise regarding construction methods and preservation techniques that would satisfy National Register requirements, while incorporating contemporary accessibility features and energy efficiency improvements. Her recommendations included specific contractor selections and material specifications that would ensure quality execution while maintaining cost-effectiveness and timeline compliance. David Rodriguez offered programming suggestions and partnership opportunities that would maximize community benefit while generating sufficient revenue to support sustainable operations. His experience managing business incubators and community event programming provided models for space utilization and service delivery that could serve diverse community needs while maintaining financial sustainability. The collaboration process itself demonstrated how successful community development required partnership approaches that brought together diverse expertise and perspectives, rather than individual knowledge and isolated decision-making. The complexity of addressing multiple stakeholder concerns simultaneously had been manageable only through systematic consultation with professionals who possessed complementary skills and experience relevant to different aspects of the project's development and implementation requirements. More importantly, the process had confirmed that the professional relationships I had developed were based on genuine mutual support and shared commitment to community-serving objectives rather than transactional exchanges or competitive networking that characterized many business development activities within traditional commercial real estate and investment contexts. By mid-September, the revised proposal had been completed and submitted to municipal departments for technical review. The supplementary materials addressed each concern raised during the initial presentation through detailed analysis, specific commitments, and documented partnerships that demonstrated feasibility and community accountability. The parking and traffic management plan included agreements with nearby property owners for shared parking arrangements during evening and weekend programming, coordination with public transportation access points that would reduce vehicle dependency, and traffic flow modifications that would minimize neighborhood impact while accommodating increased activity levels associated with successful project implementation. The market analysis demonstrated how proposed programming would complement existing businesses through collaborative promotional activities, coordinated event scheduling, and cross-referral systems that would expand customer bases for established enterprises, while introducing new services that addressed unmet community needs rather than competing for limited existing demand. The operational sustainability plan included conservative revenue projections, detailed expense budgets, and contingency planning that accounted for potential challenges during initial implementation phases. The financial analysis showed how the project could achieve break-even operations within 18 months and generate modest surplus revenues that could support facility improvements and programming expansion throughout subsequent operational years. The community engagement framework established formal advisory structures, regular communication processes, and conflict resolution mechanisms that would ensure ongoing neighborhood influence over programming decisions, tenant selection criteria, and operational policies throughout the project's long-term development and management phases. The technical review process confirmed that all regulatory requirements had been addressed appropriately, and that the project could proceed through normal permitting processes without requiring special approvals or regulatory modifications that might delay implementation or increase development costs beyond projected budget parameters. On October 15th, I returned to Richmond City Hall for the final approval presentation, carrying documentation that represented not only 8 months of intensive learning and relationship building, but also practical demonstration that systematic preparation and collaborative problem-solving could transform ambitious community development concepts into viable projects with genuine potential for positive neighborhood impact and sustainable long-term operations. The approval meeting represented the first significant test of everything I had learned about community development principles and practices, but it also marked the beginning of implementation challenges that would require continued learning, adaptation, and collaboration throughout the construction and operational phases that would transform the Paramount Building from abandoned historic property into vibrant community resource serving authentic neighborhood priorities and needs. The approval notification from Richmond City Hall arrived on a crisp November morning that marked the beginning of the most professionally transformative period of my life. The formal document confirming municipal support for the Paramount Building redevelopment represented validation of months of intensive learning and relationship building, but it also introduced responsibilities and opportunities that extended far beyond the scope of any project I had previously contemplated pursuing. The approved project would serve as a testing ground for community development principles and preservation techniques that could be applied to similar buildings throughout Richmond and the broader Mid-Atlantic region. The financial model combined multiple funding sources in ways that could be replicated for other adaptive reuse projects facing comparable challenges regarding historic preservation requirements, community engagement objectives, and sustainable operational planning. More significantly, the network of professional relationships and community partnerships that had been developed through the Paramount Building proposal process had created infrastructure for pursuing additional projects that could address systematic patterns of underutilized historic properties and unmet community needs throughout urban and rural areas that had experienced economic transitions similar to those affecting Richmond's historic neighborhoods. The success of the municipal approval process had generated interest from foundation program officers, preservation specialists, and community development practitioners throughout Virginia, who viewed the Paramount Building project as a potential model for comprehensive approaches to neighborhood revitalization that combined economic development with cultural preservation and community empowerment objectives. Thomas Chen, from the Mid-Atlantic Preservation Foundation, had requested a meeting to discuss possibilities for supporting additional projects that could demonstrate scalable approaches to historic preservation and community development that addressed regional patterns of disinvestment and demographic change that affected numerous small cities and rural communities throughout Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. The foundation had been searching for innovative models that could demonstrate how preservation projects could generate measurable economic and social benefits for communities while creating sustainable operational structures that did not require ongoing philanthropic support beyond initial development phases. The Paramount Building proposal had demonstrated exactly the kind of comprehensive approach that could serve foundation objectives while addressing authentic community needs and priorities. During the meeting with Thomas Chen, the conversation evolved from discussion of the specific Paramount Building project to exploration of broader possibilities for creating a systematic approach to historic preservation and community development that could be implemented across multiple locations and adapted to diverse community contexts and regional economic conditions. The Paramount Building represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we want to support, Thomas explained during our December meeting at the Foundation's offices in Charlottesville. But we are particularly interested in whether this approach could be systematized and replicated to address similar challenges in other communities throughout the region. His question prompted me to consider possibilities that had not occurred to me during the months of focused attention on the single project that had consumed my professional development efforts since the previous winter. The skills and relationships I had developed through the Paramount Building planning process could potentially be applied to multiple projects that addressed comparable challenges while serving different communities and adapting to varying local conditions and priorities. The concept of developing a systematic approach to community-focused preservation projects represented a significant expansion in professional scope and ambition that would require capabilities I had not yet developed and commitments that would fundamentally alter my relationship with Richmond's social expectations and family obligations. Creating a model that could be implemented across multiple communities would require traveling throughout the region to identify suitable properties and assess community development needs, building relationships with local officials and neighborhood organizations in diverse contexts, and coordinating complex projects simultaneously while maintaining quality standards and community accountability that had characterized the Paramount Building development process. The operational demands of managing multiple preservation projects would necessitate developing organizational structures, hiring qualified staff members, and creating systematic procedures for project evaluation, community engagement, regulatory compliance, and financial management that could be applied consistently while accommodating local variations and specific community priorities. More fundamentally, pursuing this expanded vision would require embracing a professional identity and level of public visibility that bore no resemblance to the social role I had been prepared for through family expectations and educational experiences. Instead of maintaining the comfortable anonymity of appropriate charitable involvement and discreet community service, I would be positioning myself as a regional expert in community development and historic preservation, with professional responsibilities that extended across state boundaries and affected numerous communities and stakeholder organizations. The prospect felt simultaneously exhilarating and overwhelming. The previous months had demonstrated that I possessed capabilities for systematic learning, collaborative problem-solving, and sustained commitment to complex projects that I had never previously tested or recognized. The success of the Paramount Building approval process had confirmed that these capabilities could be applied effectively to meaningful work that generated authentic community benefit while providing personal satisfaction and professional fulfillment. But expanding this work to regional scale would require organizational development, strategic planning, and leadership responsibilities that represented entirely new categories of professional challenge and personal growth that I could not predict or control through careful preparation and systematic skill acquisition. The decision to pursue the expanded vision would also require confronting the reality that my marriage to Alexander provided neither the emotional support nor the practical partnership that would be necessary for success in demanding professional work that required extensive travel, irregular schedules, and sustained attention to complex problems with significant consequences for multiple communities and stakeholder organizations. Alexander's response to my increasing professional commitments had evolved from polite support to benign neglect to barely concealed frustration, as my preservation program coursework and community development activities had consumed time and attention that he expected to be available for social obligations and family responsibilities that he considered appropriate priorities for his wife. The prospect of expanding my professional commitments to regional scale while maintaining the pretense of a marriage that provided no authentic partnership or mutual support seemed both unrealistic and ultimately dishonest to everyone involved in the various personal and professional relationships that would be affected by such fundamental misalignment between public commitments and private realities. During the weeks following the meeting with Thomas Chen, I found myself conducting informal research regarding organizational models and operational structures that could support systematic approaches to community development and historic preservation work across multiple locations and diverse community contexts. The investigation revealed several examples of successful regional organizations that had developed replicable approaches to community-focused development work while maintaining strong local partnerships and authentic community accountability throughout their operational areas. The Preservation Piedmont Corporation had been working throughout North Carolina and Southern Virginia for 15 years, developing expertise in adaptive reuse projects that combined historic preservation with affordable housing development and small business incubation. Their model emphasized long-term partnerships with local organizations and patient capital approaches that prioritized community benefit over rapid financial returns. The Rural Community Development Initiative operated throughout Appalachian communities in Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, focusing on economic development projects that built upon local assets and cultural traditions, while addressing infrastructure needs and employment opportunities that could support sustainable population retention and community vitality. The Chesapeake Heritage Foundation worked with waterfront communities throughout Maryland and Virginia, supporting preservation projects that addressed climate change adaptation needs while maintaining cultural heritage, and supporting traditional industries that remained economically viable with appropriate technological and marketing innovations. These organizations demonstrated that regional approaches to community development could be successful when they were built upon genuine expertise, sustained relationships with local partners, and operational models that balanced consistency in approach with flexibility regarding specific implementation strategies and community priorities. More importantly, these examples showed that such organizations could provide professionally rewarding career opportunities for individuals who possessed appropriate skills and commitment, while generating sufficient revenue to support sustainable operations and modest organizational growth that could expand services and geographic reach over time. The research process confirmed that the vision Thomas Chen had proposed was realistic and potentially viable, but it also revealed the extent of additional learning and organizational development that would be necessary for successful implementation of systematic approaches to community development work across multiple locations and diverse stakeholder environments. The next phase of professional development would require acquiring expertise in organizational management, strategic planning, financial administration, and personnel supervision that extended beyond the project-specific knowledge I had developed through the Historic Preservation Certificate Program and the Paramount Building planning process. Additionally, successful regional work would require deeper understanding of diverse community contexts, local political dynamics, and cultural variations that affected community development priorities and implementation strategies throughout different areas of Virginia and neighboring states. The learning requirements seemed extensive but achievable through systematic preparation and continued collaboration with the professional network I had developed through months of workshops, site visits, and collaborative problem-solving experiences related to the Paramount Building project. More challenging was the recognition that pursuing this expanded vision would require making definitive choices regarding personal relationships and lifestyle priorities that I had been avoiding throughout the months of professional development that had followed my wedding and the humiliating experience of my mother's pregnancy announcement during the reception. The conversation with Thomas Chen had made clear that foundation support for regional community development work would be substantial, but would also require demonstrated commitment to professional excellence and community accountability that could not be maintained, while managing competing obligations and divided attention between professional responsibilities and social expectations that served entirely different purposes and values. By February, I had developed a preliminary proposal for establishing the Historic Communities Development Corporation, a regional organization that would specialize in adaptive reuse projects that combined historic preservation with community development objectives throughout Virginia and surrounding states. The organizational model would begin with the Paramount Building project as a demonstration site that could provide practical experience and documented outcomes that would support expansion to additional communities and properties throughout the region. Initial funding would come from the Mid-Atlantic Preservation Foundation, combined with smaller grants from community development organizations and earned revenue from consulting services provided to other organizations pursuing similar projects. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.